In October of 1888, 3 articles about strange unsolved disappearances were published in the San Francisco Examiner. In the first, a slave owner in Alabama vanishes into thin air right before a group of eyewitnesses. In the second, a drunk Englishman takes a bet he can't run to the next town without stopping and vanishes without a trace after stumbling, nearly falling, but never hitting the ground. And in the third, a 16-year-old boy leaves his family farmhouse to get some water from a nearby spring and is never seen again, even though his voice is heard on several occasions by family crying out from a distance, before growing fainter and fainter over the course of months and eventually fading away entirely. What these 3 articles had in common, aside from their mysterious nature, was the name of the author, Ambrose Bierce. Today, these 3 stories, the difficulty of crossing a field, an unfinished race, and Charles Ashmore's trail, are known far and wide and have become practically enmeshed in the DNA of modern paranormal lore, told and retold so many times that they've turned into urban legends that entirely ignore their origin. What may not be as well known, however, is the fact that their author, Ambrose Bierce, himself would later become one of the most famous unsolved mysterious disappearances of the 20th century. Today, we're talking about the mysterious disappearance of author, journalist, and Civil War veteran Ambrose Bierce.
Welcome to the Castle of Spirits Paranormal Podcast, episode number 26. And Vince, I had no idea that Ambrose Bierce disappeared.
You didn't?
No, he's one of my favorite authors. I love his short stories. I'm super excited to talk about this today. I'm really ashamed to say that I did not know that the man vanished.
And it's not that he disappeared and maybe like 20 years later resurfaced or something. He never was seen again.
Wow. I'm so excited to get into this. So this is a little bit different than our standard, like haunting, cryptid type shows. This is a little bit more like a good old-fashioned mystery.
A mystery with, I think, potentially paranormal overtones.
I'm always here for a good mystery. So I'm excited that we're kind of venturing into that realm.
And to be honest with you, I don't think that I knew that he had disappeared either until very recently. We've talked about the 3 main... Well, Ambrose Bierce is known for a lot more than just those 3 unsolved mysteries. I wouldn't call them anecdotes, but they're kind of like urban legends.
Yeah, those are definitely 3 of the best. So Ambrose Bierce, he was American, correct?
He was quite American.
Was he a contemporary of Poe, or was he...
Ambrose Bierce was born in 1842, and I think Edgar Allan Poe died like towards the end of the 40s.
1849.
Okay, so there is good reason to say that Bierce may have been heavily influenced by Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah.
But Bierce would influence others like H.P. Lovecraft.
Mm-hmm.
So Bierce was born in 1842. He was the 10th of 13 children.
Oh, that's way too many children.
His mother was a cat. Actually, his mother was a very religious woman. So was his family. All the kids' names started with letter A.
That seems rather limited. Do you have a list of them there?
Yes, I do, actually.
Oh, no.
There was Almeda, Anne, Adelia, Augustus, Amelia, Abigail, Albert, Arthur, Addison, Aurelius, Andrew, and Aurelia.
Sounds like they had to get a little creative there.
And a little bit repetitive, too. As I mentioned, he was born in a very strict religious family, which resulted in him becoming a staunch agnostic. He was also a Civil War veteran. Did you know this?
I didn't know that.
He joined the military in 1861 at the start of the American Civil War. He enlisted in the Union Army, props, and served in the military beyond the end of the war into 1866.
That makes sense, though, based on, I don't know the title of the story. An
Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge.
Yeah.
He wrote a lot of stories that took place in the Civil War from things that he had seen.
Well, yeah, and that makes sense now.
And he was a veteran of the Civil War. He participated in, guess how many Civil War battles he was involved in?
13.
20.
What?
20 Civil War battles.
Man, he had some luck on his side, right?
Well, I guess you could say that.
So many young men probably didn't make it past their first battle.
That's true.
Let alone their 20th.
And One of those battles, the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, that happened on June 27th, 1864, Bierce was critically wounded. He was shot in the head.
Oh.
And he was later found breathing on the field.
Wow.
You would think that would be the end of his military career right there, but he recovered, and within 3 months, he was back into action.
Wow.
I'd be like, can I go home now?
So I was shot in the head. Doesn't that...
You'd think at some point you'd go, ow, ow,
Can I just get a Purple Heart and go?
We need you to get out there and fight. No, my head.
Yeah. I kind of have a headache.
The head, it hurts. Finally, he was discharged in January of 1865. In 1871, we're going to fast forward a little bit.
Yeah.
He was married, and he had 3 kids, 2 of which, his boys, he would outlive. He and his wife separated in 1888, but during those early years of his marriage and after his military career, he became an editor and journalist for a number of publications. He would bounce between San Francisco and England and back to San Francisco. Apparently, he was a supremely well-known figure in journalism, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, but he was also a nationally important one as well.
Wow.
He had a reputation basically for being fearless and outspoken as a journalist. His greatest literary achievement, aside from those I mentioned earlier that he never gets credit for, the urban legends, was the short story we talked about already, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which I first saw as an episode of The Twilight Zone. It was actually a short French film that was modified for running time and aired in the 5th and final season of Twilight Zone. That story has been called one of the most famous in American history and was adapted numerous times for radio, TV, movies, and even music. So he was a pretty boss writer.
Yeah. Boss. Yeah. Super boss.
He was also called one of the pioneers of psychological horror. Anyway, all that aside, probably Bierce's greatest achievement as a journalist was he single-handedly derailed, and I use that pun intentional, a congressional bailout of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads in 1896.
No way.
At the time, they were trying to sneak a bill through Congress to forgive the railroads for repaying the low-interest loans that they took out to build the Transcontinental Railroad. So Bierce got very vocal publicly, wrote a lot of articles about it, which pissed off a railroad exec who confronted Bierce and said, "What's your price?" To which he said, "My price is $130 million. And that was the amount of the loans that they were trying to get forgiven.
Oh.
And then he says, instead of paying him, that they could pay the Treasury. He wrote so many articles about the subject that it got into the public's awareness and the bill was totally defeated.
Good.
Continuing in his politicalness, at one point it was thought that Bierce had either predicted or called for the assassination of President William McKinley in 1901. This was because after the assassination of Kentucky Governor Goebel a year earlier, Bierce wrote a poem that captured sort of the dark and fearful mood of the country after that assassination. And in that poem, he wrote, "The bullet that pierced Goebel's breast cannot be found in all the West. Good reason, it is speeding here to stretch McKinley on his bier, B-I-E-R, which is the stand on which a coffin is placed." And his boss at the time, which owned the San Francisco Examiner, William Randolph Hearst, he himself had presidential ambitions. But that poem caused so much of a stir that it pretty much put an end to that for Hearst. So as you might imagine, as I mentioned before, with a man as outspoken and driven as Bierce, he was known for being something of a cantankerous person, which only got worse the older he got.
Oh, I'm sure.
Now, a lot of that has been explained as a result of his brain injury that he got in the Civil War.
Yeah.
After that, he suffered fainting episodes and just generally was an irritable person.
Well, I think also if you have a near-death experience like that, you get shot in the head in battle and wake up in the hospital and you're still alive, I think that there's an element of, having come back from the brink of death, you can do and say whatever you want to do because you understand how temporary everything is, and that,
Some people come back from things like that, though, they're very kind and forgiving, and he seemed to have amped it up a little bit. Of course,
yeah.
like they say, it could have been the brain injury itself.
Yeah. Well, you come back changed. And
right. I guess, for better or for worse.
Yeah. There's definitely a change. And I think your perspective on life and the things that are important, it changes no matter which end of the spectrum that change is from. There's definitely a change that I think would naturally happen.
And that sort of thing, that sort of vibe that he carried for the rest of his days, it might have been what ultimately led to his disappearance.
Oh.
Which to this day remains unsolved.
Is that a question?
Is it? Maybe I have the answer.
Ooh.
Maybe I don't.
Next, we're going to solve the Jimmy Hoffa case.
So, okay, now that you know a little bit about Ambrose Bierce, we are going to move on to his disappearance.
Yes, this is what I've been waiting for. Let's have it.
In 1913, when Bierce is 71 years old, he was living in D.C., and he decided to do a tour of his old stomping grounds and visit all the Civil War battlefields, which by then had become places that people visited.
Tourist attractions.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So he did a tour of all the places that he had fought. At the end of the trip, he was reportedly seen in El Paso, Texas, where it's said that he crossed the border to Mexico. Mm. Just across the border from El Paso is the city of Juarez. Mm-hmm. It was here where it's said that Bierce joined Pancho Villa's army as an observer.
Interesting.
At this time, Mexico was involved in the Mexican Revolution, which ran from about 1910 to 1920, and it succeeded in toppling the dictatorship and establishing a constitutional republic. And Pancho Villa was a hugely important figure in that revolutionary movement. So it's believed that Bierce rode with his army as far as Chihuahua, which is where his last known written words, which were mailed to a friend in the States, were postmarked. Mm. Dated December 26, 1913, the letter closes with these words from Ambrose Bierce. As for me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination.
Oh, that's cryptic.
Very cryptic. And it figures. Ambrose Bierce, maybe he knows he's never going to come back. Maybe he doesn't know. In either case, he nailed it.
Yeah.
The question now is, where did he go and what happened to him? Here are the theories. Theory 1. The theory is that Bierce was killed during a battle in Mexico. That's kind of it's almost a no-brainer explanation for what could have happened to him if he went down there and looking to hook up with Villa's army. The idea that he could have maybe lost his life in a battle or even been killed in an accident and his death was never reported or discovered isn't beyond the realm of possibility.
Right.
That kind of stuff happens all the time. 1913, some guy down there in Mexico, nobody knows who he is. Maybe he was killed. Maybe he was buried.
In his 70s, though, you think he'd take up arms and jump into a battle in his 70s?
Yeah, but this is an old Civil War veteran, and I don't know, maybe jumping back into the fray, saying, "Look, there's a revolution happening over here. I'm going to go check it out," because energizing it may have made him feel young again.
Yeah, maybe.
And he may have been in physically good condition. I don't know. I don't know what kind of shape he was in when he was 71. So that's the first theory. Theory number 2, which does carry a lot of weight, is that Bierce was arrested on the suspicion of being a spy, either for America or for Pancho Villa, and executed. In Sierra Mojada, an old mining town in northern Mexico, there's an oral history that tells a story of an old gringo who was executed by a federal troops firing squad and buried in the town cemetery with an unmarked grave. James Leinert, who was an American priest who had a parish in Sierra Mojada, actually had a tombstone erected in the cemetery in 2004. Leinert knew a guy named Don Chewy, who said he was a witness to the execution when he was young. This is also corroborated by Tex O'Reilly many years before. Tex O'Reilly was a journalist and a contemporary of Ambrose Bierce's. Mm-hmm. And he heard, shortly after Bierce went missing, he heard rumors that an American had been executed there in Sierra Mojada. And so he went to investigate. Mm-hmm. O'Reilly learned that an older white man had come into town with maps and lots of questions about where to find Pancho Villa's army. So he's going around asking questions. Yeah. And the federal troops had already taken over this town. And they think that they thought maybe he was looking for their enemy or that he was some sort of interloper. Bierce didn't even speak Spanish. So he was out there
sticking out like a sore thumb.
Possibly, and they might have been interrogating him and he didn't know enough to answer their questions. Mm-hmm. He only knew enough to ask, where am I going, you know? Mm-hmm. And they think that he might have been executed. O'Reilly even wrote that he had discovered personal effects left behind, 2 of which were empty envelopes with Bierce's name on them. So if this theory is the case, I don't think it's a tragedy so much as like the realization of a dream come true for Bierce. And the reason I say that is he wrote a lot of letters when he was on the road and when he was in Mexico. But in one of those final letters, he wrote to his niece, "Goodbye. If you hear of my being stood up against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, please know that I think it's a pretty good way to depart this life. It beats old age, disease, or falling down the cellar stairs. To be a gringo in Mexico, that is euthanasia."
Wow.
So he may have even predicted what was going to happen to him. And some of these letters don't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like at some point, everything just becomes lore.
Right.
And Ambrose Bierce becomes this mythical person who may have gone down to Mexico like a crazy old man to fight, maybe looking for action, and maybe he found it. Now, that is the theory that has the most, I'd say, proof, if anything, or at least it's the most realistic sounding.
That's definitely one that I could subscribe to.
Yeah. So on to theory number 3.
Okay.
Bierce, who had years earlier displayed a fascination with mysterious disappearances, ended his own life in an unknown location and in a manner as to leave people guessing. If that's the case, it worked.
Yeah.
His disappearance did not go unnoticed.
It's on brand for sure.
And it was not soon forgotten. In fact, in his 1955 short story titled Missing Persons, author Jack Finney mentions the disappearance of Ambrose Bierce in that short story. And he even solves it, at least in fiction.
Wow.
Which basically shows how more than 40 years after he vanished, people were still wondering.
Well, so what did he write? What was that story about?
The story was about a man who goes to a travel agency and he is shown a package which basically takes him to another planet where life is wonderful and peaceful. And in the course of telling the story, telling, what can you expect when you get there, the guy mentions we started this around about 1913 and Ambrose Bierce was one of our first vacationers. And he continued, he lived on for another 30 years and he wrote several more books, all of which we've enjoyed.
Well, that's really quite the collision of worlds, isn't it? I mean, no pun intended with the travel agency, but Jack Finney, and we've talked about him before too, he's another one of these authors who has written mysterious stories that have been taken up and passed around as being true.
Right. His most famous story was The Body Snatchers, which became Invasion of the Body Snatchers. However, and we did talk about the short story that he wrote of a man who appears in New York City, a time traveler who's run over by a car.
Yeah. The story is called I'm Scared. And the character was named Rudolph Fentz.
Rudolph Fentz, exactly. That was complete fiction.
But every once in a while, along with Ambrose Bierce stories, you get on YouTube, it's like top 10 mysterious disappearances that are totally true. And that's how I first became aware of Ambrose Bierce. I was watching, one of those videos on YouTube about, mysterious disappearances. And the story that was shared was The Unfinished Race. And I was just blown away. I'd never heard anything like that. And so I started Googling it because I wanted more information on this supposedly true story. And then I was kind of disappointed. I was like, oh, it's a fiction story written by this guy, Ambrose, what's his name? But, ultimately it led me to read a lot of his stuff and it's well worth.
Oh yeah, he was a great, great writer who very likely could have imagined the life that all of this has taken on.
Mm-hmm.
Now we come to theory number 4. With theory number 4, things start getting a little weird.
Yes.
This is the lost Mayan crystal skulls theory.
Indiana Jones
style.
Mm.
I mean, Harrison Ford is in his 80s and he's doing a new Indiana Jones movie. Why can't Ambrose Bierce at the age of 71, 100 years ago, be kind of like Indiana Jones? In search of that lost crystal skull.
I suppose he could.
So let me give you some backup. Back in the mid to late 1800s, there was a kind of explosion in the interest of ancient civilizations. At this time, there claimed to be a bunch of crystal skulls discovered that were attributed to ancient Aztecs and Mayans, that they were attributed by the people who found them, quote unquote found, but they were likely manufactured in the 19th century, very likely in Germany. because they were doing a lot of that sort of stuff at the time. Right about here is where the Ambrose Bierce theories take a plunge off a deep end of believability, but they're nonetheless fascinating. This story has it that Bierce, who in this scenario had gone to Mexico not to fight, but in search of the source of the skulls, he managed to manipulate the alleged paranormal properties of the skulls to hail aliens to his location to come pick him up.
I mean, that sounds pretty reasonable to me.
Because this planet sucks. Or even to dive through a hole in time.
Mm.
See, when these crystal skulls were becoming popular, there were these theories that you could use them to contact aliens, travel through time. So we now must examine the possibility that Ambrose Bierce became a time traveler after stumbling upon an actual real crystal skull, which did not exist in ancient Mayan or Aztec or any other culture back then.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember when the crystal skulls kind of had a resurgence in popularity in the 80s, because I remember when I was a kid at the school library, it was a National Geographic magazine or some kind of magazine like that had a crystal skull on the cover. And I was so fascinated with that magazine.
I have never really looked into crystal skulls and what their deal is. So I was a little bit surprised to find out that they don't look like they come from ancient civilizations.
No.
They look like an artist's, a contemporary artist's sort of rendition of what maybe a culture back then might have aspired to artistically or something like that. So take that theory in any way you will.
I kind of like it.
I do like it. But theory number 5 is my favorite one.
Okay.
American writer Francisco Goldman is Ambrose Bierce. Goldman, who was born in 1954, and he's very much alive to this day, is included in a strange theory that Bierce discovered the fountain of youth in his journeys throughout Mexico and Central America. This is also based on a supposed resemblance that Goldman has to Bierce, which is quite compelling considering they each have 2 ears, 2 eyes, a nose, and a head.
What? I've not heard of this author. What's his name again?
Francisco Goldman. Now, Jane, I invite you to pick up your phone, and anybody listening, get on your computer, however you get to the internet, and look up Francisco Goldman, Ambrose Bierce. And in the way that they are both human males with hair on their heads, they do resemble one another.
Yeah, though I did look them up individually, and they do, curly hair, male, 2 eyes, a nose, a similar face shape, and there's cheeks and a jaw.
And if you stumble upon the fountain of youth, you're able to age reverse.
Yeah.
Now, why would you actually stay being at this point? How old would he be now? 69 years old? But that's anybody's guess. I'm not willing to venture that guess.
That one seems a little less believable. Did Francisco Goldman write that theory? Is that his theory?
He did not write that theory as far as I know, but maybe we should work on a theory that I am Ambrose Bierce.
No, I don't want that one.
Oh, okay.
But I do. I have theory number 6. How
you
Ambrose...
do? Okay, tell me.
He went down to the Mexican border, the U.S.-Mexican border, and just as he was getting ready to cross into Mexico, he fell down, and before he hit the ground, he disappeared.
Just like in one of his stories. And that kind of actually is a theory that I've contemplated. I didn't put it on my list of theories because I didn't think it through too carefully. But we talk a lot about, and when I say we, people these days talk a lot about intention and manifestation. The fact that Ambrose Bierce was the author of a trio of stories that detail the most bizarre and frightening disappearances that you can possibly think of. Somebody who's here one second and just gone the next. You turn around, they're never seen again. What is the possibility that he carried those stories with him and somehow managed to manifest them either intentionally or unintentionally? There are such things as spontaneous human disappearance, spontaneous human time travel, spontaneous combustion, all that sort of thing. Maybe Ambrose Bierce spontaneously Bierced out of the world. I mean, can we entertain that notion?
Maybe. I mean, that's certainly possible. If you look at, it's like Edgar Allan Poe. So he is also writing these stories about kind of the dark side of humanity and horrible things that people do to other people. And then he turns up beaten and concussed and passed out or whatever in someone else's clothes and mysteriously dies from whatever it was that happened to him. It's kind of a similar thing, I think. Maybe it's like a version of the Bader-Meinhof thing. You know, the more you focus on something, the more you start to see it, or maybe you're attracting it.
Well, I was trying to think of some sort of contemporary examples of that.
Mm-hmm.
We have yet to find out how Stephen King will meet his end. He almost met his end 20-some years ago when he was run over.
And the way that he was run over, honestly, sounded like something that he would write about.
Yeah.
He was hit by a car because the man driving it was being attacked by his own dog.
Right. That sounds like something that would only happen in fiction, and it happened in real life.
Right.
But fortunately, he did not die because
Right.
we would not have gotten the end of the Dark Tower series.
That's
and
true.
We finally got it.
Yeah, that's true. But ultimately, I kind of like that we don't know exactly what happened to him. I think since I didn't know that before this episode, I almost feel like knowing that now just it adds a little extra something to the stories, right? Knowing that he didn't just like live this normal long life and die of old age in some retirement home in Palm Beach or whatever. That seems very anticlimactic, right? For his career. That it just doesn't feel like it's on the same curve or the same story arc. But the fact that he did disappear, it's so on brand, and
it's
like the period at the end of a good sentence.
Right. And it's a beautiful arc when you think about that his most famous story, an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge.
Mm-hmm.
What happens in that story, not to be a spoiler, is that a man in the instant of his death imagines himself escaping to freedom and running back home to his wife. And then he finds himself at the very last second hung from a rope. Who's to say that Ambrose Bierce didn't experience the very same thing in his life? He was shot on the battlefield when he was in his early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was shot on another battlefield in his 70s. And everything in between those two instances may have been a dream that he had, a dream that came into our reality, but that sort of gave him a beautiful bookend, I guess you could say. He was supposed to have died back in the Civil War. And he ended up living a long life and then finally returning to the same place where he has to pay his debt back, where I can imagine death approaching him and saying, there you are. I've been looking for you for 50 years. Now I'm going to take you. And here's a bullet in the head now.
Yeah, you escaped from me before.
But that escape has come to an end.
I like that.
It's poetic.
It is.
So that is theory number
7D12.
7D12. Is that the angel of death returned for Ambrose Bierce, 50 years delayed, and got his man.
Yeah, very poetic. So we keep talking about these three stories. How will our audience know the glory of these stories?
Well, there are two ways that our audience can know the glory of these three stories, known as The Difficulty of Crossing a Field, An Unfinished Race, and Charles Ashmore's Trail. They can either go forth onto the internet and find them for themselves because they are public domain stories, or if you'd like, we can come back in a few days on an extrasode of the podcast and read those stories. What do you say?
Extrasode number 12, in fact, right?
I believe so.
Yeah, we could do that. I'm excited for that.
So if you're interested in hearing our renditions of these Ambrose Bierce stories, just have to tune in to the next extrasode, our bonus episodes, and we will give those to you, deliver them straight into your ears.
I'm here for that. I like
no cost.
Free of charge. Well, I guess we're done.
Yeah. With that, we hear the music.
The spirits are calling and we must go.
That music is to me like a Pavlov's dog bell is to the ghosts that must be fed.
You start drooling, do you?
And lest we feed the ghosts, we may be ghosts ourselves. So
Was that your attempt at poetry?
That was. And that was pretty good, actually.
I don't know that I would say
I think
was
it could
real
win an
good.
award or two.
Probably not.
We'll see about that.
Okay. So thank you for listening. Make sure that you head to castleofspirits.com, sign up for our email list, hit us up in the lounge if you have questions, comments, want to join in the conversation in some other way. And you can submit your very own paranormal stories to us at castleofspirits.com/submit.
If you like this podcast, please share it with a friend.
And if you hate it, share it with 2 enemies.
That'll learn them nice and good.